This happened a few days before the 4th of July. I was taking my 2 younger sons to visit my mom with my brother for the day. They were playing downstairs while I smoked a cigarette outside, waiting for my brother to come pick us up. My 18-year-old had opted to stay home, so he was hanging out upstairs. I had just put out my cigarette when the front door to the apartment building next door flew open. A young woman dashed out onto the porch and made her way towards me. "Oh yes, thank you, God, could I please get a cigarette from you?" I was pretty taken aback by her enthusiasm, especially since I had never seen her before, so I just stammered, yeah, I guess." She ran over to get the cigarette, and as she scurried back to her house, she yelled back at me, "Hey, what's your name?" I awkwardly introduced myself. She just responded with an okay, without returning the gesture, before continuing back into her apartment. My brother showed up soon after, so I just loaded the kids into the car and didn't think much else of it. We got back home about 4 hours later, and my older son was waiting at the inside door when we arrived. He asked me if I knew any random girls in the neighborhood, and then gave a perfect description of the cigarette girl from earlier. I said yes and explained our strange interaction. "Well, that explains it. She's been over here every half hour since you left asking when you'll be home." I immediately got pissed. The idea of some strange woman coming and bothering my son when I wasn't home did not sit well with me. I could see he was a little unnerved too. I asked him when she was last at our apartment, and he told me it was just 15 minutes ago. "Don't worry," I told him. "I'll take care of it when she gets back." He looked relieved. "Good, I don't want to see her again." Half an hour went by and she didn't show up, so I figured she had given up. Maybe she wasn't all that weird. She probably saw my youngest son and realized it was time for me to get him ready for bed. Almost as soon as that thought crossed my mind, the doorbell rang. My oldest son looked over at me. I smiled and told him, "I got this." Now, I should say, I don't look very intimidating. I'm average height and a little overweight, but my dad was a drill instructor and the army taught me well. Several of my friends that I spar with regularly, all of which are in the military, will tell you that my looks are deceiving. I'm never worried about standing up to weirdos, especially when it comes to my kids. I went downstairs and opened the door, and sure enough, there was Cigarette Girl. "Oh, great, you're home. Can I please get another cigarette from you?" I explained to her, politely but sternly, that I wasn't here to support her smoking habit. She tried to bargain with me, telling me she'd buy a pack later when she had money. I know it's ridiculous, but I did feel a little bad for her. Still, I stuck to my guns and told her no, and then asked her to stop coming over since she freaked out my son, and I was a little upset about that. She gave me a confused look and apologized before walking away. I closed the door behind her, figuring that we were done for the night, but I was wrong. My husband arrived home from work about 10 minutes later, and I filled him in about Cigarette Girl. He laughed. "If she comes back, let me answer it. I'm stressed and I need someone to take it out on. It'll be fun." I laughed back and agreed. Sure enough, about an hour later, the doorbell rang again. My husband ran out of the bedroom with a huge grin on his face. I waited at the top of the stairs to watch the show while he went to answer the door. When he opened it, Cigarette Girl was there, and I mean right there, almost ready to burst through the door. But this time, she wasn't alone. 2 guys stood on either side of her, completely covering the doorway. They all looked up, shocked. My husband is 6'7" and over 300 pounds, with hair past his waist and a long beard. Unlike me, he doesn't need training to be intimidating. He's a bear all by himself. He smiled. "Yes, can I help you?" Cigarette Girl stammered and the 2 guys took a few steps back. She immediately backpedaled and asked him if we had a phone to use. My husband simply replied, "Nope." "Oh, well, is your wife around?" "Yep." Well, do you think I could get a cigarette from her?" "Nope." They were clearly taken aback at how no-nonsense he was being. They stood there for another minute before she awkwardly thanked him, and they all walked away. My husband locked the door behind him and came upstairs, looking mildly concerned. Why exactly did she need 2 extra people to use a phone? I just shrugged, not thinking too much about it. A week passed without any other run-ins with Cigarette Girl. I was out on my front porch when I saw another resident in her building walk up to her front door and bang on it, hard. Cigarette Girl opened the door, and the two of them began arguing loudly. I walked over to the edge of my porch to get a better view, and heard her accusing Cigarette Girl and her two scummy friends of stealing things out of her apartment. They yelled at each other for a bit longer before the cops showed up, and at one point it even escalated to Cigarette Girl going after the other resident with a knife. Luckily, the other girl was fast and hit her with a baseball bat she had brought outside with her. I continued watching from afar and figured that must have been her motive the day she was harassing me and my sons as well. Since the cops seemed to take care of it, I shrugged it off. Fast forward to last night. It was 3 a.m. I was up quite a bit later than I usually am and decided to go outside to have one last cigarette before I went to bed. When I went out onto my upstairs porch, I heard Cigarette Girl and her two friends get out of a car. They walked up to her apartment, talking loudly and complaining about how, surprise, they were out of cigarettes yet again. The houses in our neighborhood don't have driveways and they're really close together, so you can hear pretty much everything that happens outside. I couldn't see them, but since I'm so used to the sounds of the neighborhood, I knew that their voices were coming from her porch. They went inside and I finished smoking, but before I headed back in, I heard her door open up again. A moment later, I heard rustling and a single step on my downstairs porch. Then, I could hear my front door jiggling from down below. I heard a man's voice mumble something, and Cigarette Girl replied, "I'm trying." I couldn't believe that they were so blatantly trying my front door. I cleared my throat to scare them away and immediately heard them scurry back to her apartment. Luckily, I've been reading a lot of scary stories online like this recently. I don't usually lock my downstairs door until I'm ready for bed, but my recent paranoia prompted me to do so last night. I don't want to think about what would have happened if I hadn't. This story is about something that happened to my mother around 1972, when she was 8 years old. She's been telling me about it since I was young as a cautionary tale, and I can tell it still affects her to this day. My grandparents ran a restaurant and a gas station in our hometown at the time. They've been running similar businesses since the 50s, so my mom was used to taking the school bus home and staying by herself for a few hours while my grandma finished up helping Grandpa for the day. My uncle, her older brother, would usually come home on the bus with her, except on the days that he had football practice. This was the case on the day that this all happened. My mother arrived home, let herself in the house, and put away her school things. She had recently gotten a puppy and knew that she had to take it out for a bathroom break right away. She wrapped the dog up in a white towel and walked him outside. As she put the dog down and shook its shedded fur from the blanket, she noticed the neighbor's son staring at her from across the street. This guy was in his late 20s and was known to be mentally ill, but in the country back then, people didn't seem to recognize mental illness and instead would just comment on how strange he was. He had some concerning behaviors, like killing the neighbor's pigs or skinning stray cats and hanging them from the clothesline in their yard. Real sick shit. But again, it was the country, and people didn't seem to realize that this type of stuff should have been treated as warning signs. My mom says that he's always creeped her out, and that he would stare at her when she would play outside, making her feel constantly uneasy. She said that he seemed to appear out of nowhere in his yard that day, and as she shook out the blanket, he was grinning and waving at her. Feeling a bit shaken up from the sudden sight, she picked up her pup and headed inside, locking the door behind her. She started on her homework, and after about 5 minutes, she heard a loud knock at the door. She slowly walked over to the window to check who it was, suspicious because she knew it wasn't my grandparents or her brother. They would have just let themselves in with their own keys, and she couldn't think of anyone else who would come by around this time. As she opened the blinds, her eyes locked with those of the neighbor from across the street, as if he had already been looking in the window for her. She jumped back and let out a short scream as she shut the blinds and checked to make sure the door was locked. He continued his slow, rhythmic thudding on the door, and she became truly terrified when he began speaking to her. "Hi, sweetie. I saw you with your doggy. Let me in to see him. Let me in, please. I want to see your puppy." My mom screamed for him to leave her alone, practically begging him to go back to his house, but he just kept pounding on the door. I can still see the fear in my mom's eyes when she describes this. She ran to the basement where the only phone in the house was and began to dial 911, when suddenly she heard a shatter from the next room. She looked over to see her neighbor attempting to crawl through the kitchen window he had just broken. He ripped down the curtain as he pulled his upper body through. My mom screamed into the phone to let the police know what was happening. That's when she noticed that he was bleeding from his abdomen where the window glass had cut him during his attempt to crawl through. From behind him, my mom heard my grandmother's screams. "What the hell are you doing?" She began hitting him with some tools she had found in the garden while he yelled in pain and squirmed out of the window. He finally managed to get out and bolted back to his house. My grandma called my grandfather, and he arrived home around the same time as the police after shutting down the store for the day. They arrested him for breaking and entering, along with some other unrelated charges, which we think had to do with some sort of probation violation. On the day of his court date, he tried to defend himself somehow, but this was the last straw. They finally admitted him to a mental institution, and the last my mother heard, he ended up dying there years later. Outside of the courthouse, his redneck family berated my mother, the father blaming her for what happened and calling her a harlot. My army-trained grandpa had no patience for this, and beat the guy's ass right there on the courthouse steps while the local cops turned the other way. My mom's been in therapy, and has done her best to overcome the fear that this experience instilled in her. It's been so many years, but we all still wonder what might have happened if my grandma hadn't come home at that exact moment. My bedroom has floor-to-ceiling windows which face the backyard. I rarely feel the need to close the curtains because I don't want to shut out my great view to the trees, and it makes my dogs and cats happy to see out there too. My yard is encircled with a tall fence and a thicket of bushes and trees on both sides, all of which are on my property. A couple weeks ago, I pulled into my driveway and was greeted by a woman waiting for me. She claimed she was out there out of concern for the neighborhood children. According to her, she and her kids had seen me through my windows dressed inappropriately while they were hiking. I told her that wasn't possible. The only way that anyone could see in my windows would be through my own backyard, which is far from any hiking trail. She replied in a condescending tone, "Well, sweetie, I'm sorry, but I have proof." She pulled out her phone and showed me a picture she had taken of me in my underwear through my window. It was very blurry, but I knew it was me. I could see my hot tub, pool, and garden in the foreground of the picture. Shocked, I pointed out to her that the only way you'd be able to get a picture from this angle is if you were in my backyard. I asked her directly if she and her kids had jumped my fence. Instead of giving me a direct answer, she began lecturing me about how inconsiderate it is to be an exhibitionist around children. I told her I would never exhibit myself in a situation where I thought young children could see me, but also that I wasn't expecting anyone to trespass in my own yard. She ignored the mention of trespassing and launched into a tirade about how she's sure I must be very proud of my body, since I've clearly paid enough for it, but that's no excuse to expose myself to children. I have breast implants and some skin removal due to weight loss, and a few tattoos to cover scars, but only people who have practically seen me naked would know any of that. She ended her smug little tirade by saying, "So honey, you'll be closing your blinds from now on?" I told her that no, I absolutely wouldn't be, because only people on my property could see in the windows, and that she and her children were not welcome there. She dropped the sweetness and started bitching that the previous owner of my home had been family friends and hadn't locked their gates. She criticized me for having a butterfly garden without letting kids visit, and complained that it takes them half an hour to walk to a park if they don't go through my yard. She even said that she had seen kids at my place before, so her kids shouldn't be excluded. At this point, I was pissed. I told her I locked my gates to keep assholes like her out. She just kept harping on the fact that she'd seen other kids at my place, which I quickly pointed out were family members, not that any of that was any of her business. She started scream-crying at me like she was possessed. I went inside, but she stayed out there for a few minutes, going on and on about being disrespected and how she was going to call the cops because I was a pedophile whore. A few days afterwards, the psycho returned, but this time with a police officer. She had reported that I was exposing myself to her kids and making threats on her life. Frustrated that I even had to do this, I told the officer my side of the story and showed him my backyard so he could see that the lady's photo evidence could have only been taken while trespassing on my property. I realized while looking at the printouts he had with him that the pictures hadn't actually been taken on several different occasions. I was wearing different garments in each of them, so she must have been photographing me for weeks or even months. It seemed to click for the officer at this point that this lady was completely unhinged, so he began questioning her about the trespassing and photos without my consent. He told her that I could actually pursue charges if I wanted, at which point her tantrum reached a new level. She started babbling about how she thought I was a prostitute because she saw men over occasionally, and how there was no reason for me to own such a large house with no children, stringing her words together wildly as she went. The officer tried to calm her down by saying that they would look into it, but that right now they were only discussing her trespassing and taking photos of me without my consent. I ended up telling the officer that I would drop the whole thing without any charges, on the condition that she delete the pictures of me on her phone and never set foot on my property again. Of course, she didn't agree to either condition, but the officer eventually convinced her to hand over her phone so he could delete the photos. The agreement to stop trespassing, on the other hand, was a sticking point. She insisted tearfully that it wasn't fair and that she didn't understand what the problem was. Eventually, the officer gave up and just told her that this was an official warning, whether she wanted to accept that or not. I thought that would be the end of it, but it's come to my attention that she's been going door to door in the neighborhood, claiming that I'm a pedophilic prostitute and asking people to sign a petition to get me to move. After sharing this story online, I decided to take some of the advice I got in the replies. The cost of legal fees would have just been insane, so before going that route, I decided to have the police go to her house and tell her that she had to stop, legally, or she'd be in deep shit. Things were pretty quiet after that, until a few days before Thanksgiving, when I came home to find yet another stranger in my driveway. This time, though, it was a much more pleasant experience. It was the woman's adult son, coming to apologize for his mother's outbursts and fill me in on what his family was doing about her. He was a really nice guy, and was candid about answering all the questions I had. According to him, his mom had been taking her children on hikes that cut through my property for years. The people who lived there before me had been cool with it. His mom had caught his high school-age brother looking at me through my window a few times during their walks, and was extremely upset about it. She felt like my presence was corrupting their mother-son time. He told me that he thinks the inciting incident for his mother's tirade against me was when his younger brother pointed me out to him when she was around. She got really upset and cried in her room for the whole night, screaming at anyone who tried to talk to her. We figure that that's probably around the time she started sneaking into my yard on her own and taking pictures of me. The rest of the family had no idea she was doing this, and also had no idea about the petition or rumor she was spreading. That was until the police showed up at their door. After the visit from the police, her family confronted her, and she had a huge freak out, claiming that I was trying to seduce all of the men in her family, and ended up threatening to kill herself. They called the cops and ultimately had her committed. Apparently, this wasn't the first time she had done something like this. All of her previous outbursts involved her paranoia about non-Jewish women near the family. The neighborhood was mostly Jewish, and honestly, I might be one of the only non-Jewish people around, so perhaps that aspect triggered her. For now, she's in an institution. I exchange contact information with her son so that he can inform me about when she's released, and I can contact him if she's ever in my goddamn yard again.